Anyway, thank you for coming here so late. I understand that you may be tired. You are looking forward to the reception. So I hope my talk won't tire you too much. Anyway, a little bit about me. I am Jan. I'm developer advocate at Superface. We are a small startup from Czech Republic. And what we do at Superface, among many other things, is that we integrate APIs a lot. And what we are learning about that process and already learned is that like the biggest problem or the most expensive part about integrating APIs isn't like building the code itself, but it's the analysis. And it's all those parts like understanding the API, reading the documentation, understanding how to use it, how to match it with your application. So today I'm going to talk about APIs from developers' perspective, how developers perceive your API, and what you can do to help them based on also on our very own experience. So for the purpose of this talk, I will play a role of a clueless developer, which is something I'm very good at. And I will treat you, my audience, as API providers. Sorry for representing you as this neat hexagon. Regardless whether you are already, if you have some API, maybe you are planning to build one, or you are just curious, like, what is it about, like bringing APIs closer to developers? So for start, let me ask you a question. Why should I use your API? Maybe think about it for a bit. Maybe it's the case that your API is the only one in the world. Maybe I don't have any other choice. But usually it's more like it boils down to the fact that your API solves some problem for me or for the company I work for. But when I put it this way, it's very generic. I mean, like, I don't think your API will do my laundry, for example. So let's put it in more concrete terms. Like, I will probably use your API to fulfill my application's use case. And what do I mean by use case? It's some specific scenario where your API can be useful, some feature of my application where your API can help. So consider this scenario. I am building a user registration system with stuff like login, signing up, and also password reset. So that's my use case. I need to send a password reset email. And as I'm thinking about this feature, I figure out that I will need to send that email somehow. Maybe I will use some, I will use some external API, some API provider to do the email sending for me. So I will look for some email providers like this one. This one is called Simple Email Service. So I assume it should be simple. So maybe there is my use case somewhere around here. But like all they talk about is features like flexible deployment options and nothing about password reset emails, really. So I will search further and maybe I will find SendGrid and then tell me we can send transactional emails. And what are transactional emails, I ask. And then on their solutions page, they show me how transactional emails are used, including password reset emails. So that sounds promising. And they also give me some examples of those emails, some template I can work with. So I know that this could be the right service for me. And maybe I decide to use SendGrid for this feature. So, and this, maybe that's sort of like a trivial example for you, but I wanted to illustrate something deeper, what's going on. When I break it down, my use case is to send password reset email. And I figured that what I'm looking for are transactional emails. So I'm trying to map my use case to some capability of the provider, some features they offer. And this is also the hard part about understanding APIs. Like, I think about my use cases in my language, while you, as a provider, present your capabilities in your language with your terminology. And well, I'm not an expert in your domain. That's why I probably use your API in the first place. So as a developer, I need to map my use cases to your capabilities and translate that terminology and data structures and understand all the flows. And that's usually the part which takes us the most time when we deal with an API, where we don't understand the problem domain. So let me give you another, maybe more convoluted example. Say, I want to know how my open source project is doing, and the metric of popularity on GitHub and GitLab are stars. So I want to monitor who gives a star to my project. And I want to know that on GitHub and GitLab. So I will look into documentation for each of these platforms. So let's start with GitHub. I learned that each repository has something called stargazers, which is how GitHub actually calls people who give a star to the repository. And now I understand the concepts and I can translate them for my own needs, for my use case. And I also need to figure out whether I will use the REST or GraphQL API. And then I can translate my use case to that particular API. Now let's take a look at GitLab. While GitLab has a concept of repository, it's something different than GitHub's. In case of GitLab, they call it projects. And instead of stargazers, they have something called starters. So I really need to understand these differences. And sort of like ironically, like the prior knowledge of GitHub API can be sort of misleading here. And again, which is sort of nice coincidence, even GitLab offers both REST and GraphQL API. So again, I need to decide which one I will use. And I should rather hope that both of these APIs provide even the same features. Like, this isn't always the case. And sometimes these interfaces sort of drift apart. So as developers, we have to do a lot of mapping when integrating an API. We need to understand the concepts and the domain of the API. And then we need to actually translate our use case to those specific API calls. And beside that, we need to also understand business rules, like things like rate limits, or how is pricing structured, or what authentication scopes I need. Actually, like how does the authentication works, or how API changes are announced and handled. Like what happens if there are some API deprecations? Will you break my app? So for me as a developer, there's a lot of stuff to cover when I'm integrating an API. And just to break it down, I need to understand the problem domain of your API, what's the terminology, what are the processes. I need to understand the business rules of your API to know what happens as my usage increases and what's the impact on long-term maintenance. And I also need to figure out what your API offers as features and capabilities and which are relevant to me. And finally, when I get all of that, ideally, I can map my use case to your API and actually start using that API in full. So now the question is what you, as API providers, can do to make the integration process easier for me. Well, one idea is to treat your API as a product. I mean, like at this conference, maybe you heard it from more people, and so it's nothing new for you. Why I'm pointing that out is that, and with a product, you should have someone like a product owner or product manager for that API. And if that sounds obvious to you, that's great. But in our experience, that's usually not the case, because many times companies just like toss out their API as something like, look, developers play with it, like we don't care. Or they just like have like various teams having different ideas what an API should look like. So the overall experience of external developers working with APIs, even from a single company, can be really miserable. So the basic idea here is to have like a single person or maybe a team responsible for your APIs. And one of the responsibilities of product owner is to understand the users and their needs. So in case of APIs, this also includes understanding the domain of your users. What's the context in which they will use your API? In other words, API product owners should understand and discover use cases of your users. And well, the best place to start with that is user research. Like just ask developers who use your API, or if you don't have API yet, maybe you have some partners who can give you some ideas and would be interested in API. But just keep in mind when you are doing a user research that developers like talking about technical stuff, and we would surely like to tell you which technologies we like we love GraphQL, maybe we hate SOAP, but that's like not the point here, especially when you are discovering those use cases. You should rather ask like what they are building and how they want to use your API to fulfill those use cases. You could also take a look at your competition if they have any API. And maybe like one obvious idea is maybe you could copy their API. And like maybe that sounds ridiculous to you, but maybe you heard about this thing called from Amazon S3. Do you use it? Yeah. So S3 is my favorite example because maybe you know that there are like now many providers with their own blob storages like Minio or Cloudflare. Cloudflare has this R2, and all of them implement S3 compatible API. So this is sort of like their competitive advantage. I think like Cloudflare is like the most prominent example, because actually the name of their product, R2, is based on S3. Like it's one word and one letter and number in alphabet, like better than S3. So that's a possibility. It makes sense in some domains if you have like large, maybe almost like monopoly provider, and you will sort of like chip out their market share. But keep in mind that like when you are doing this, you are also taking over all the bad design decisions they made. You are also taking care of all the undocumented features your users will eventually rely on from the original API. So rather than copy it, maybe you can just take a look and think how you can improve those upon what your competitors build. Maybe you can simplify the terminology, or maybe you can simplify some processes and flows. For example, if I need to do multiple calls to competitors' API to fulfill my use case, maybe I could do it just like with single API call in your case. And my favorite complementary approach is to look at the code to see how APIs are actually used in the wild. So like one of the obvious place to start is GitHub, and start by entering your company name or URL of your API into GitHub search, and maybe you will be surprised what you will find. Also, GitHub repositories are organized into topics, which can be helpful for better understanding of the domain you are trying to navigate and learn about. In some domains with multiple API providers doing the same things, here I have examples with cryptocurrency exchanges or geolocation, there are popular multi-provider SDKs, how I like to call it, which implement the same interface over various APIs. So if this is relevant for your domain, take a look at how these SDKs are used and whether that's something you could even acknowledge. Because if you, for example, provide like the implementation for this like multi-provider SDK, it could make adoption easier for your users. And speaking of usage, you can also check dependency graph for every project on GitHub. So you see actually what are the projects and even packages relying on particular, for example, SDK. It can be your SDK or your competitors. Now, ideally, these few tips can help you better understand where your API can be used. And now, when you have better idea, you should tell me when I'm reading your documentation, you should show me what are the use cases for your API. So here are the few examples how API use cases are presented. Many developer-oriented companies have a section on their website called Solutions. Here's example from Stripe, where solutions are categorized by most common groups of their users, like SaaS companies, e-commerce, or crypto. And when I look at e-commerce solutions, for example, I can see how their products can be relevant for my particular use case. However, from my experience, and also I'm doing it myself, like developers love to skip those marketing presentations because they are full of some fluffy marketing copy bullshit, basically, and they usually dive straight into documentation. And what they will find there? Well, in case of Stripe, I mean, like, if you know something about API documentation, you probably have heard about Stripe documentation, which is given like the prominent example of written and organized documentation for developers. And like, there's a reason why is it so, because they navigate me straight to their most popular product, which is payments, but they have also other products, and they like easily explain to me how is that relevant and whether it is something I should look at. In contrast, and it's very, very common, documentation is for other providers organized like this by their products, where they treat each API or even each version of API as a separate product. And in case of here.com, they have these, like when I would like to do, for example, routing, like navigation, they give me here routing API, here isoline routing API, here matrix routing API, and here waypoint sequence. And like just from looking at this, I have no idea which one I should use. But maybe you do? Do you? Yeah. Another thing to include in your documentation are use case guides as a sort of basic navigation to help developers to understand your API. So here I have example from News, which is a cloud-based hospitality system for property management. And their API is, honestly, their API is very complex and abstract. But they have this comprehensive documentation for common scenarios where their API is used for, which explains common flows and points me to parts of the API which are relevant just for my use case. And finally, use case tutorials can be very useful for new developers, but here's a catch. As Adam Duvender from Every Developer points out, many times documentation covers so-called product tutorials, which are focused on particular features of your API. But what we should look for are use case tutorials. And Adam gives this example from Twilio, where their docs, the documentation includes this appointment reminders use case. And this basically guides me like how to build appointment reminders with Twilio API in various languages. So, but it's sort of like a rare gem among many other product-focused tutorial in their documentation. Here's another example from GitHub. In their documentation, they have this tutorial on how to build a CI server in Ruby with their status API and webhooks. And again, this is very, very useful for me as a developer, because instead of telling me the theory behind their API and giving me just references to their endpoints, they just show me the code and I can learn from it and adjust it to my use case. A third example I have is from Vonage, which is a Twilio competitor. In that case, in this example, they give me a fully working contact center code and instructions how to run it. Actually, the code itself is in a separate repository. These are just instructions on how to get it up and running. But I would say this is maybe too much, because now I need to study someone else's code to understand how it all works. And honestly, that's like less fun than like just writing the code right. Now, how you can apply these use cases here in your API design. So here's, say, call it a modest proposal. But if you are building or maybe revising your API, you could start with user research and use cases discovery. This should give you a better idea of real-world use cases for your API. Technological decisions should come after that, like what sort of API makes sense for these use cases. Like many developers will tell you that they hate SOAP, for example. But like if you are navigating more like enterprise domain banking, maybe the SOAP is like a given standard there. So why not use it, right? Now, the choice of technology also informs how you will design your API. If you follow the design first approach, you will create some specification, for example, open API document or some schema. And this will help you actually with building and testing your implementation. But you can also use the specification to build and test these use case guides and tutorials, even before you build your actual API. If you write the specification right, you can mock it, you can iterate like over the mock code and like see how much your design fits with those use cases. So to tie this up, I should probably answer the question in the title of my talk, why your API doesn't solve my problem. Well, the answer is usually because I can't understand it. Because you show me your API, you show me its capabilities, but is it enough? Well, typically these capabilities you are presenting to me, you give me API references, specification documents, like OpenAPI, in a better case actually. And this is also covered by product tutorials, these capabilities. And I like to think of these artifacts as a map to your API. You give me some idea where I can go with your API, but I need to find my way around. Now, the solutions and guides which explain use cases, they act as sort of like a compass, which help me to navigate your API and lead me to my use case. And the use case tutorials, they are sort of like bike, which get me faster to my goal. And what's important here, these three categories, they are not meant to replace each other. They are complementing each other. So use case tutorials are great for getting to know your API, to understand your problem domain, and like to sort of gather the terminology. And as I become like more experienced with your API, I can just like look at the reference when I need some new feature, and I don't need, maybe I don't need those use case tutorials anymore. But still, it's something which really helps with that initial first step to adopting the API. So this is what was in the scope of talk originally, but I wanted to address recent developments from the last few months. So here's one more thing, and let's address the elephant in the room, and those are large language models. So especially OpenAI's GPT. So let me ask you a question. Who here didn't try ChatGPT? Oh, okay. And I have one more question for those who didn't raise hand. Who of you use it like regularly as, say, part of your work, at least like, say, once a week, once a month? Anyone? Maybe even more often? Yeah. Like in any capacity, like if you like make it part of your workflow. Just two of you? Interesting. Maybe I'm even lazier than I thought. So, but I don't want to talk here about like how ChatGPT is revolutionary and it will change like all the work we does and it will take our jobs. But I want to focus on APIs. So if you remember that example I gave you with GitHub Stargazers, ChatGPT, even like the GPT-3, which is like the older, less capable model, it can actually give me like a fully working code when I ask it for my use case. And this is pretty nice. So this can be like a part of your discovery process, but unfortunately, GitHub and like these very popular APIs are something which the model knows well because it's heavily represented in the training data. But if you ask it for some like lesser known API, or actually maybe some API which was introduced after 2021. Like here I have example with Breezy, which is an HR system. And I ask for their API. I ask, hey, I want to give me an HTTP request to list open jobs on Breezy. And ChatGPT, as you maybe probably yourself experienced, it tends to like came up with new things. It's sometimes very creative. So it doesn't know Breezy API well, but it saw a lot of like API documentation. So it will assume, open jobs. That could be like some open jobs resource endpoint, and maybe there will be like authentication, right? Like, so I will just put a better access token. Well, I mean, that isn't right. This is the actual API call you need to get these data. They call it positions instead of open jobs or jobs. And there is even like a versioning prefix, there is company prefix. So yeah, this doesn't work. Maybe some, and sometimes it even gives you like comically wrong answers. Like here, for example, I have asked about Pipedrive API, which is CRM, like sales system, and I wanted to get open deals. And it figured out the path and endpoint well, but it decided the status of those deals will be won. And it actually tells me here, in this case, we set it to the status parameter, we set it to 1 to retrieve open deals. But you can also use status open to retrieve all open deals. So you need to actually still like verify what it gives you, and really depends on the popularity of the API for if you want to use ChatGPT this way. So what is actually happening, or what you can do to use these tools for to give you like more precise answers, and what companies actually do, they train those models on their API documentation to sort of like refine it and give it like more up-to-date data. One prominent example is, well, again from Stripe, which is actually a close partner of OpenAI. And they are now running a closed beta on their documentation assistant. I will try the video here. Let's see if it works. So it's sort of like a super smart search, which will generate here the user asked what's the test mode, and it generated this on-the-fly summary from the documentation. And there are now like companies and projects forming around this idea that maybe we could like give developers an AI assistant trained or on particular documentation, so we can make the API analysis and usage simpler. But I think it's sort of like missing like all the potential we can get from these tools. And to explain what I mean, I will do a sort of like sidetrack here and take a look at this totally accurate schema. Like this is sort of like our mental model of how APIs work, right? We are building and integrating APIs to connect machine to machine. But the reality is closer to this. First, a human needs to build those APIs. Another human, or maybe the same human, needs to document those APIs. So another human can actually read the documentation, and also human needs to write the necessary glue code and this is even simplified because you have all the discovery phase, sales process, testing, purchasing, and also maintenance. So what the AI assistant, like the one I showed with Stripe, I showed, is that it is basically sort of like the mediator between the documentation and the integrator. And it can simplify things a lot, but still it's like the human asking the documentation, asking that chatbot, and finally interpreting that API. So here's the idea. What if we let the computer do also the analysis and interpretation of the documentation for us? Maybe it could read the documentation, create a glue code, and the developer just like put it in their application. And maybe even better, the generated documentation could be decoupled. And if there are any future API changes, we could just regenerate a glue code without changing the application. Well, here's a very, very rough early technical preview of how this could work. So this is something from us, which we are currently testing internally. So the idea here is that you will select an API provider, in this case Pipedrive. I ask it to get open leads, open deals, and it generates this GraphQL interface for me. And I actually get like the full schema here with input and output types. And when I run it, yeah, it actually works. So this is something what we are testing. It basically works, but there are many rough edges. So just to share it with you, sorry. Here we go. So it turns out that taming GPT's creativity is quite hard. So my colleague gave me this example, like where he's using GPT to actually evaluate whether the given API can be used to fulfill some particular use case. Like, can we search for Star Wars characters in a weather API? And GPT-4 said, yes, that's possible. Because you can get weather information about Star Wars locations from that API. So yeah, it can get like very creative. And there are more challenges with this approach. What happens, for example, if the documentation gets outdated, then what we generate doesn't really match the reality of that API. And we are basically like, again, this basically we get something which isn't useful to us. So here's a final idea. Maybe in the end, we could get rid of the documentation and eventually replace humans in machine-to-machine communication altogether, where one machine exposes their capabilities and the another machine discovers, purchases, and consumes those capabilities. And we see some first steps in this area. Maybe you have heard about AutoGPT and even OpenAI. They have these ChatGPT plugins. But we would like to make it cheaper, more reliable, and actually usable for developers through what we call autonomous integrations. So, to tie this up for real this time, again, I've showed you how references, use cases guides, and use cases tutorials can help with adoption of your API. Now with these large language models, there's also this AI documentation assistants, which I like to think of them in this analogy as sort of like turn-by-turn navigation, because it really can help like personalize the navigation for the developers and guide them straight to what they need. But if you give developers power to build their custom use cases, they'll get to their goal much faster, like with some like motorized vehicle. And where we are going, maybe we don't need any navigation at all. Like imagine a self-driving car for APIs, but that's a topic for another time. Thank you for your attention. If you want to contact me, here's my website with all my contact information. What we are building is at superface.ai. And now, if you have any questions. Okay, I see that you are looking forward to that reception. So thank you for joining here, and see you around.